So the slides and the recording are going to be made available to you. Live attendance is required to receive the CEUs. And to claim the CEUs for today's training, you do have to be in person and complete the NASW CEU survey that we'll be sending out. So you're going to receive 2 follow-up emails. The first one will be from us with that survey and any of our training materials. And then there will be a second email that's going to be sent out by Portland State University's Institute on Aging. And they keep track of all of our evaluations and give us feedback. So please do complete that survey for us so that we can know what you learned, maybe get some ideas for other topics that you're interested in, and any suggestions or comments. And if you complete that survey, you'll also receive just a general certificate of attendance if you would like that. Okay, so a little bit about the Oregon Older Adult Behavioral Health Initiative. We were launched in 2015. We are funded by the Oregon Health Authority, and we work to meet the needs of older adults and adults with physical disabilities to get timely access to care from qualified providers. And we engage as specialists. There's 24 of us across the state who are attached to 1 or more counties. And we do collaborations and coordinations with systems of care and different community-based organizations. We help build knowledge capacity through free workforce development trainings and community education events. And we also provide complex care consultations for folks that are supporting older adults that are experiencing behavioral health and they need some new ideas or just some system navigation help as well. So if you want to learn more about what we do, you can go to oregonbhi.org and find your county specialist and also some information and resources around this. So today, this is a collaboration between the Southern Oregon Older Adult Specialists. And so today we have represented Angela Jensen and myself from Josephine County. We have Jami Kwan Rudd from Douglas County, Janine Greenwell from Jackson County, and Luhati Anderson from Coos and Curry. So if you live in these areas and you don't know us, please do reach out and we would love to collaborate and support any of your efforts. And then also we wanted to just touch on next month is another series with Lydia Bartholow, and she will be talking about harm reduction, substance use, and older adults. And she works for Central City Concern as a nurse practitioner up in Portland, and she has some amazing things that she has developed and utilizes. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and give our presenters time to bring up their slides while I introduce them. And let's see. Okay, so the Peaceful Presence Project reimagines and transforms the way communities talk about and plan for and experience the last stage of life. So they are cultivating a compassionate communities model of care, and they are working to improve death literacy to improve end-of-life experiences for all. And our trainers today are Erin Collins, who is the program director. She's a NEDA proficient end-of-life doula, and she also just received the 2022 Cambia Health Foundation Soldier Scholar. She is a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with 16 years of nursing experience in hospice, adult and pediatric oncology. She, again, is a trained end-of-life doula, and she's the vice chair of the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization's End-of-Life Doula Advisory Council. That is a really long title. So She is a bedside yoga end-of-life care provider. She is a graduate of the Being with Dying program at the Upaya Zen Center, and she is an end-of-life nursing education consortium care and communication trainer. We also have Elizabeth Johnson, who is the executive director of Peaceful Presence Project. She as well is a NEDA proficient end-of-life doula. She has a master's degree in community and urban planning. She's traveled the globe as an educator and facilitator, awakening her fascination of the cultural and social contexts which shape human understandings of mysteries of life and death. And one of her formative experiences included working as a volunteer at the Kalighat, Kolkata-based hospice for the sick, destitute, and dying, established by Mother Teresa. So Elizabeth is a member of the board of directors for the Central Oregon Council on Aging, and she is passionate about integrating death literacy initiatives in local communities and encouraging the honest dialogue around the complexities of the dying process. She's a graduate of the Anam Cara Project. She's a certified advanced care planning educator for the Institute on Healthcare, and she also is a graduate of the Being with Dying program at the Upaya Center. So I would like to welcome these two wonderful humans to give us a training today on grief literacy, and I'm just going to hand it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And it's really great to be here with all of you today. Erin and I have been looking forward to the time that we have together, really focusing the core of the conversation, the exploration today on grief literacy. So just to revisit some of the learning objectives that we stated in the overview that was shared with everyone. One, our desire is to really kind of explore a more holistic understanding of grief and loss, what that experience entails for people, especially related to to older adults in our communities here in Oregon. Looking at tools and language around that's available to us to both recognize and respond to grief experiences for those that we're supporting, hopefully in more skilled and competent ways. And then third, just practicing what it looks like to maintain a more grounded sense of self-awareness as we show up in these places of complexity and suffering. And when Erin and I knew we had 2 hours, we thought, oh my gosh, we're going to pack so much in here. And then as we started looking through the content, we realized we actually had to take a lot out and thin it down just because there's so much to cover. So a caveat of, what we're focusing on today is by no means exhaustive. There's so much more to explore. We're just giving you what we feel like are some really helpful both hopefully meta overviews to contextualize a lot of the grief experience, and then again some tools to work with both for yourself and those that we're supporting in whatever role you fulfill as both a human, right, in your personal relationships and also professionally. So as Angela said, for us as an organization, our mission is about reimagining and transforming what it looks like to really normalize, talk about, and be supportive around these experiences of serious and terminal illness. And our work is really guided by the compassionate communities model of care. The focus for us as a nonprofit is to ensure that as many people as possible are able to access equitable and compassionate support at the end of their life. So the workshop today is not about us as an organization, but just to sort of ground a bit of what we do. So our organization, the Peaceful Presence Project, really focuses in 3 main areas. We do a lot of community and clinician education around death literacy, around grief literacy. We train individuals to the end-of-life doula skill set and have a particular focus on bringing this competency and the skill set to rural Oregonians so that there people in either a personal or professional way can be supportive to individuals navigating these experiences. We also do a lot of holistic advanced care planning work, and then we do the compassionate bedside presencing for individuals and families navigating these experiences. So at the end, the last slide has a link to our website, and we welcome anybody to come check out our website, and also reach out if you feel like there's a way that we might be able to collaborate or support anyone in your work. So we want to jump in and start off with this quote, which comes from a New York Times interview with a woman named Dr. Diane Meyer, and she's the director of the Center to Advance Palliative Care at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And this quote comes from an interview she was giving when she was reflecting upon the pandemic and the way in which it has really traumatized millions of Americans, especially related to the grief experience. And she says, the only treatment for existential and spiritual pain is relationship, attention, sitting with, not trying to fix. That willingness to be with and engage the person in giving voice to that suffering is such a powerful intervention. It isn't about we can fix everything, but we can enable giving voice to profound suffering, and that makes a huge difference. So we really wanted to start our time here together with this quote, because at the heart, it really does sum up perfectly what we are exploring in this workshop, right? That it is about the way we be with the grief experience more than this, this pressure around kind of fixing everything associated with grief, right? It is really about the humanity and the capacity to be with. So we want to, the objective one that we highlighted, we want to offer some reflections that just might help us develop a more holistic understanding of the grieving process, and start to feel into this question of how did we get here, especially culturally, right? Why is it that we tend to be pretty unskilled and also unlearned when it comes to navigating experiences of grief and suffering? So I'm just going to walk us through some of the things that we have here on the screen. One being that, right, when we start to pay attention to a lot of the language that we use, it oftentimes perpetuates this attempt to stay kind of disconnected or in command of any experience that we perceive as being uncomfortable. There's a woman named Susan David, who's a psychologist from the Harvard Medical School, and her work talks a lot about this understanding of how much our cultural dialogue is radically avoidant. And she gives this simple example of, when we look at the language that we use around places of discomfort or suffering, we oftentimes can hear ourselves or others saying things like, I'm coping, if they just learn how to cope with this, everything will be okay. We hear this all the time. The word cope is actually a derivative of the word coup, which means to strike. So Susan David says, what we see here is that built into our language is this understanding, right, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that a part of us needs to be in defense against or, kind of protected from things like grief or loss or suffering. And that there's this stance of kind of needing to triumph over that which does not feel good to us, right? So our culture, we know, sees pain and suffering and grief as being really heavy and messy, especially, when looking at things like grief or death, things that feel like they're places of not being in control. And we, right, regard these experiences as things oftentimes that need to be fixed, somehow cleaned up or altered or made better. And now, right, at this point in our history, as humans in our day-to-day lives, we actually do have the capacity to oftentimes have the answer or to have an intervention available to support something. We're deeply rooted, as I have here on the screen, in this kind of mastery orientation to the world, where we perceive everything we encounter as a problem that we can solve. And so one of the byproducts of this is that we start to see everything in life as this problem that we might be able to step in and fix, including if we're talking about grief. There's also this concept known as premature consolation, which was introduced by Resma Menakem, a trauma specialist. And he talks about, we strive to make everything feel fine or okay, or, kind of settled before we've actually done the work to really grapple with and be present to difficult situations. And as we start to follow that thread, right, we can see that play out in a lot of areas in our lives. We don't want to face or really deal with the tough stuff a lot of times. We also have this cultural kind of obsession with the sensation of ascendance versus descendance. And we oftentimes quote the work of Francis Weller, a psychologist, who says, we're fearful of this downward movement, right? We like the feeling of happiness and levity and light. And our collective and our individual psyche sort of attached to this value of being productive, of pushing through, of staying in the positive. And so a lot of times those who are navigating a grief experience are, more often than not, find themselves in these places of intolerance or impatience or frustration because, they're not embodying that which we're taught to really culturally value. So because grief is sometimes not perceived as being a normal life experience, we can find ourselves trapped in these places of denial, and people who are grieving are oftentimes really isolated, right? Whereas grief and suffering are meant to be things that we share, right? We are social beings. The majority of people, as we know, are asked to be in a lot of these spaces in really solitary manners. So in some weird way, we have started to we have for years privatized the experience of grief and suffering. So because of this, right, everything, what happens for people is we tend to make people be in their pain alone. We dismiss or undermine others' experiences because of our own discomfort oftentimes. We do all that we can to bypass our suffering, again, because we don't oftentimes have the tools or the practice to know how to be with. We put our pressure on ourselves to make things better, right? When they can't be better, they are as they are, but to make things better, to say the right thing, to find the magic fix. And then as a consequence, we really fail to listen to other stories because we hyper focus on this idea of getting better. So what this reveals is that we are usually anything but present, and without intentional practice, we don't know how to be with these more intense spaces. And there is a need to cultivate a lot of these tools. So what we're doing here today really is building up this grief literacy. And as a reminder, grief literacy is defined as skills and knowledge that enable thoughtful action and care for those who need it. So just, kind of as a reminder for us, and we'll go into these points in different ways throughout the 2 hours. One, we need to know through our grief literacy kind of training that there are no set stages. And Erin will talk a little bit about the older grief theories and what we actually know about grief. There's no right way to grieve, right? Grieving is informed by what we've been taught culturally, religiously, kind of the family origin piece. Are we an internal or an external processor, right? What are our needs around the grief experience? Grief can be really unpredictable. We like maps as humans. We like to know what to predict. And there is something about the grief experience that is inherently very difficult to know where it will go and what it will look like. Grief is not something to get over, to solve, or to be cured, right? We like oftentimes regarding grief as this kind of mental health issue or an emotional issue that if you could just get in there and insert the right things, somehow you'd make it a lot better and different, that we could cure somebody from this experience. Grief can be all consuming. There's so much interesting literature and research coming out around kind of the neurology, the brain-based and the body-based experiences around grief, and that we are exhausted oftentimes in this experience because it is so consuming on all different levels. Grief can involve secondary losses, meaning you have, your husband dies, but then all of the other things that surround that loss that we're asked to navigate that we oftentimes don't talk about or know how to prepare for. And then grief can cause a wave of these existential questions, right? Oftentimes it opens up this big, kind of chasm or distance between us and the rest of the world. And we feel very alone and unprepared for this. So I'm going to pass it over to Erin to take this next section.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think next it feels like a good kind of maybe a little bit of a back step, but just to ground ourselves in what grief is. Alan Wolfelt is a grief counselor, and he's the director of what's called the Center for Loss and Life Transition. And this slide is adapted from his description of the basics of grief and mourning. And as Elizabeth said, grief is really unique. It's really individual. And it's really built on a lot of different factors based on your own identity. And so ultimately, grief is whatever you think or whatever the person thinks and feels inside. It's an intrinsic, internal, natural response to loss. It's very necessary. And it's something that we learn to live with and we learn to integrate. We don't move on from. It's not an illness. It's not a mental health issue unless we aren't allowed the opportunity to grieve, or we don't have this sense of grief literacy and normalcy around the grief process that allows us to have that normal, natural, personal experience in whatever way it looks like. And I'll talk about that in a minute, that grief can become complicated and can lead to other health issues. On the contrary, mourning is our outward expression of our internal experience. So we feel grief in a number of different ways based on a number of different individual factors. But the way that we mourn a loss, the way that we move through our grief or move with our grief is by outwardly expressing it. And that comes in all different kinds of flavors. It could be crying. It could be, kind of sobbing, crying. And in some cultures, that really exhaustive, kind of expressive form of sobbing and crying is a very natural way to mourn. And sometimes for other people, that doesn't seem so natural. And quieter ways might be just sharing memories. And this is one way that we can really support each other in the community, is allowing for that sharing of memories about someone who has been lost, no matter what that timeline looks like, no matter how long it's been. For some people, mourning can come just through writing about their loss, praying about their loss, rituals and ceremony, right? What is a funeral or a celebration of life after all, but the opportunity to come together as a community and mourn a loss together, to express our grief in community. And then the last point is that mourning is the way in which we begin to reconstruct our lives. As I've said, we don't move on from our grief. We don't get over it, but rather we take the opportunity to express what we're feeling inside as the way that we start to take steps forward and to begin to reconstruct, to restart, to take the next step in our life. The next slide, please. So if grief literacy is the understanding of loss and the ways that we respond to or act upon this understanding, the way that we can normalize and support one another, it's imperative to understand that there are different types of grief and different types of loss, especially for the older adult. And I'll go through these briefly, but preparatory grief is really the way that an older adult or someone who has an illness has a cognitive, an emotional, even a spiritual response to the recognition of their mortality. And if somebody has a serious illness and knows that they have a shorter lifespan, they start to have these experiences, these feelings about what this shorter lifespan means. What does it mean that I'm going to die soon? And so they start to prepare. It's a very natural process. And then anticipatory grief in a similar way is felt before a loss actually happens. And this might be what we see in a companion, a spouse, a friend, or a caregiver, is that anticipation of what it's going to be like when that person is gone. Or it doesn't even have to be a person, right? Grief, as we're kind of talking about it today, is in relationship to being an older adult and mortality, but there are so many losses that we grieve. And so it could even be about the loss of a job, right? As you're working with someone who knows that their job is coming to an end, and they may be grieving what they're going to lose in income, in relationship. What is that going to be like when that's no longer there? And then, as I mentioned, grief can become complicated. Complicated grief is a prolonged, intense grief experience because there were barriers to the normal process, right? So sometimes for example, someone who has a contentious relationship with someone they've lost, that grief may be caught up. They might not be feeling the emotions as much, the process of their grief, because they're so caught up in what they're mad about that person or what that person didn't do. And although that is a part of the grief, not allowing for the full range of emotions and the full range of experiences, as I will talk about in a moment, can lead to this complicated sense that this is going on way longer. The intensity of the grief is going on way longer than we would expect. Although there's no timeline, the normal process is that someone does start to move through and experience grief in different ways that allows them to go back to their usual routine and their usual way of going about life. And then the fourth one here, I think, is really important to mention for all of us here who are healthcare providers, and this is disenfranchised grief. The grief around a death or loss that can't be acknowledged or not kind of socially acceptable or publicly mourned, because there's an expectation that you won't grieve. You're a professional, so why would you're going to have these losses all the time. It's especially true this came really clear in the COVID pandemic, how many nurses and healthcare providers, there was so much death and so much loss, and they weren't allowed the opportunity to mourn those losses or to even experience their grief. And so because it was just, they had to move on to the next one. Or, people are just, it's assumed as a mental health or behavioral health specialist, it's just assumed that you've got it all covered. You probably just do with this all the time. And so you wouldn't necessarily be having it. And so there's kind of this concept that it's not really allowed for you to grieve. And that becomes problematic. That's what really leads us as providers, as helpers, into areas of empathic distress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. So again, normalizing this process, normalizing the ability to grieve, and making sure that we all understand the natural process that grief is and that mourning is, can help to prevent problems down the line. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth mentioned that, traditionally we've understood, or it was grief was kind of explained as being on a timeline or as stages that were very linear. And these early theories were like, you had the loss, you went through the shock phase, you went through denial and bargaining, acceptance, and then you came out the other side and you were over it and you moved on. And what we've learned over the years is that the reality is much more like what you see on the right side. Those stages are all present and they are all valid, and it's all really important work that we acknowledge about grief. But the reality is it is anything but linear. It is all over the place. These stages happen concurrently. They happen immediately. They happen many years later. When I was working here in Central Oregon, I worked at an inpatient hospice unit. And I remember having a family member. I can distinctly remember her coming out of the room after her person had died. And I kind of met her in the hallway, and I had been taking care of her person. And she looked at me and she said, "Okay, well, so what's my timeline? Like, what should I expect? Like, when will I get over this?" And, she really wanted to know, as Elizabeth said, we like maps, we like timelines, we want to know what's coming next. She really wanted to know when she was going to get over it. And I really just gently explained that there's no timeline, that you will experience your grief in different ways almost every day from now on. And it can be years later that a memory comes up, or that you find yourself angry, or you find yourself numb, or, just like this picture, it's all over the place. And how we companion that is to normalize all the variations, to welcome all the different experiences in whatever order they come. Next slide. And so these patterns and these different experiences are similar, as you may all be familiar with, the typical responses to fear, right? Fight, they used to say fight, flight, or flee, or fight, flight, or freeze. Blah. I have it here as fight, flee, freeze, or face. And so what we'd like to do, we always teach that it's important when we show up in these spaces of grief and death literacy, the starting point is to begin to have our own experience as our foundation. And so we want to take just a couple of minutes here, if you have a pen and paper, or even just to ponder, just to close your eyes and ponder your own personal typical response. So bring to mind, a time that you were grieving a loss of any kind. Did you fight and have a lot of anger that surfaced around that loss? Did you flee thinking that I could just outrun this pain? I can avoid this. Did you freeze and feel numb or paralyzed? Or maybe for some of you, you're able to face that grief. So we'll just spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes kind of thinking or writing about what your typical response has been. And if that comes real quickly, maybe reflect on what would a different response look like. Not that any of them are right or wrong. In just a couple of minutes. So just starting to kind of wrap up your ideas before we move forward. Your typical response and what a different one might look like. And that creates the foundation for you to understand what someone else's response is looking like. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Erin. So we know we can't talk about the grief experience and the value of grief literacy without also bringing in the total pain model. And I'm hopeful that a lot of you are familiar with this conceptual framework that was introduced initially by Dame Cicely Saunders, who is the founder of the modern hospice movement. And this model strives to demonstrate that the pain that we experience in life is not solely physical, even though this is where the medical model tends to place the most emphasis, the most focus, and rather that pain and suffering can be these complex overlays that source from physical as well as emotional and social and spiritual pain. And our sense of well-being is greatly informed by how these pains are intersecting and in conversation, and how prepared those around us are to support and respond to our pain points in hopefully a holistic and person-centered way. So we all know what physical pain is, right? It's that feeling in the body of my leg really hurts. I think I'm having a heart attack. I'm constantly tired, et cetera, right? We know that kind of assessment. Emotional pain tends to be those sort of interior terrains where we might be expressing things like sadness, anxiety, fear, overwhelm, et cetera. Social pain, it can include the pain associated with, either social or familial relationships, right? Something around that's causing us a lot of strain or pain, suffering from maybe, older adults and social isolation, right? The sense of disconnect, disenfranchisement from the world, maybe shifts in a role that we play in the world, where we just don't understand how we fit into these larger structures. So the social pain can be really present for us. And then spiritual pain, right? Typically associated with a person's sense of meaning, of purpose, of hope, right? Of being kind of in the center of my life and liking what I see. So if we're interested in providing person-centered care, we need to be engaging individuals through this total pain lens. Right. And as we have here on the screen, this quote by Dame Cicely Saunders, the way in which care is given can touch the most hidden places, meaning we have to be willing to see and then hopefully skillfully engage beyond just the presenting physical pains. And as I'm sure, as you've all worked with individuals in your respective professional roles in the world, as well as, those, personally, oftentimes it's the emotional and the social and the spiritual pains that can be more pain inducing than anything. It may be manifesting in ways as physical pain if we're not really willing to do a bit more of that present deep diving with someone to see what else is here. But oftentimes those are the pains that cause somebody that greatest sense of isolation, of paralysis, of despair, etc. So really zoning back into, the specifics of grief in older adults, which is, a lot of the focus of today's conversation. Just some things to kind of bring front and center for us. One, research shows that 25% of older adults socialize with another person less than once a month. So looking at that social pain piece, right, this can be a real grief-inducing reality when individuals feel, again, very disenfranchised or disconnected from the greater world around them. When we talk to older adults, we know that a lot of the day-to-day grief they experience can be connected to this. Research shows that suicide rates are higher in older adults compared to most other age groups. And not to say that there's always a direct correlation between grief into depression into suicidality, but just to know that unrealized grief experiences can oftentimes be a source of that sense of, I'm not sure if I can continue to go along in life, right? That there's not something here that's worth my staying in life, right? That there's something about this that hurts enough and deeply enough for me. And then really keeping our eyes on what are known as the 4 Ds that are oftentimes, a core experience for older adults in our communities. One, the navigation of depression, and how that plays out in terms of our people recognizing the grief experience that I'm having, right? Do I have outlets for this? Navigation of disease, the sense of I am holding something that is really difficult for me to manage on the day-to-day, and do I have sort of this supportive ecosystem of care around me to help me navigate this disease? And if not, right, what sort of grief might be associated with that? Again, going back to that piece of social disconnection. And then third, disability, right? And for a lot of people, that sense of my disability keeps me distanced enough from the wider world, which feeds into all of the other things that we have here on the screen. So for older adults, grief can manifest from a variety of different sources. Grief can be really individual, as we've said multiple times, right? There is not the grief trajectory that every single person will confront. And at the same time, we also do see trends around some of these experiences. So it's important to know what these more patterned sources of grief might be, and really be able to name them for people. Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist, a lot of you might be aware of his work. I love his work. And one of the things he's often found saying is that he says, name it to tame it, right? Meaning that there's value in being able to name an experience in order to see it, to normalize it, and then to be able to signal to someone, okay, we've got our eyes on this. You are not alone. We're in this together, and I'm going to accompany you in this experience. So, first off, it's important to remember, as Erin said earlier, that grief is not always connected to a death experience, right? I think a lot of times, socially, culturally, we hear grief and we think, oh, that person must have lost someone. There's all of the big and little deaths that we confront, the big and little losses that we confront on a daily basis that can impact where we stand in relationship to our own grief. So some of the things we have here on the screen, I just want to highlight are oftentimes, for older adults particularly, primary experiences of loss that then can connect back to the experience of grief, and a question of how do I navigate this. So one, relational loss, and for older adults, this oftentimes could be, loss of a spouse, the reality of I used to live with someone and now I live alone, right? Low social support, maybe less community engagement, the sense of, people used to come around and now because of my illness, nobody calls anymore, so relationally, things have shifted and therefore I'm experiencing grief around this. There can be a role-based loss that older adults experience, right? I'm navigating this new illness, and now I don't know, will I be able to go spend time with my grandkids, right? I used to be known as fun grandma, and now will I still be needed in this family? Am I going to be accepted, or will I kind of be, pushed to the side, right? So what role do I see as primary to me as a human, and in what ways might this experience shift that? A lot of older adults will experience functional loss, right? The sense of I can no longer walk to the front door. I'm more dependent on my ADLs, my activities of daily living, and therefore, I'm in my life in a way where the dependence creates a sense of grief. I'm needing others in a different way, right? And for a lot of people, especially those of us that identify as very independent, that can be very grief-inducing. Material losses, right? The sense of, how much I need these procedures, how much is this going to cost? Where will I live because I have to get up, I can't get upstairs anymore and I've got to move because of this new disease. Will this bring me into, debt? What will this mean for the family? All these material losses that can also bring up a lot of grief. Intrapsychic loss, which is the experience of losing what we regard as an emotionally important image of ourselves, right? So the death of a dream, of losing these, possibilities of what might have been, the abandonment of the idea of what I thought life would be, can be really grief inducing. And then, as Erin talked about, the anticipatory grief. What if this spreads to my lungs after this? What will that mean, right? What will it mean when my family no longer is able to stay in this house because I'm going to be gone and I won't be able to pay rent? So again, as you support someone, it's really important to engage the total pain model, right? That framework I talked about earlier as a means of assessing, right? What is going on here? What are the greatest pain or grief points that are, kind of emerging for this person? And what can I do to help to name, hopefully, and then as I said earlier, normalize this for them. And then hopefully say, okay, and this is what we can realistically do to respond to some of these things. But a really helpful first step is to bring these losses out into the light, right? For a lot of us, the underbelly of these experiences is that we can experience shame, a lot of silent suffering, a sense of isolation. And again, going back to this place of, I think I might need to do this by myself. And that can be really disorienting for people. So we recognize that we are doing a lot of talking at you. So it is 9:46 here, Pacific Standard Time. I think all of us are in Oregon. So we're just going to give you a 5-minute break. Do whatever you need to do to stand up, do a bio break, move your body, get yourself, a warm drink or water, whatever you need. And we'll be back at, let's say 9:51, if everyone can just respect the 5 minutes. Okay, take care of yourselves. Okay, we'll give everyone another minute or so just to finish up and return to us here on the screen.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had the opportunity to take a little pause and feel refreshed. As Elizabeth is ready, we'll head to the next screen. And we want to head into kind of the tools section. The idea of empathy bridging that was mentioned. How do we create a bridge between us and the person we are companioning or supporting? And so empathy, as you probably all are aware, is the ability to feel into what another person is feeling. And so we wanted to share this short video to start to bring us back. So it's not just us talking, but we love this video. And so Elizabeth will play it and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about it.
Got to come off mute, I realize.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So really what you're on the next slide. Really what this is about is recognizing and responding to grief in a way that normalizes and is present with what is. As you heard, it's not about putting a silver lining or fixing something for someone, but rather just being still and being there and letting them know that you're with them, that you're there for them. It's about encouraging reflection with simple interventions, right? Simple ways of asking open-ended questions, but not too many. In a moment, we're going to talk about ways that we can listen more skillfully and respond with empathy. And in this normalizing and being present, especially as older adult specialists, there are things to look for, to be aware of, and to know when to make referrals. Things like social withdrawal, right? These more complicated grief responses, when someone is completely withdrawing or feels consistently sad or hopeless, especially over a very prolonged time. It might arise as pervasive anxieties, recurring visions or nightmares, that traumatic response, and absolutely suicidal thoughts. These are all things to explore in more depth. And some of you may have the skills or the licensure to respond in that way. But if you don't, please make a referral and reach out so that we're supporting folks in the most appropriate ways. Next slide. So we heard a little bit of this in the Brene Brown video, the difference of sympathy and empathy, right? And just responding with, well, at least you don't, I love the one, at least Sarah's a straight A student. Well, like, yeah, but they're both my kids, right? So some of that is this idea of listening with the intention to respond. And we've all done it, right? And we all kind of do it from time to time. But listening with the intention to respond, you're not really listening at all. You're formulating your response in your head. Another way that we don't listen is denying or invalidating a person's experience. You shouldn't feel that way. It makes them feel like it's wrong. Another one is that I always cringe at is like, well, you know what you should do. You know what you need. Right? That's invalidating a person's experience. The biggest pet peeve of mine on this list is interrupting, not allowing that person to completely express their thought. It's not listening at all. Telling your life story, chapter by chapter, right? Maybe you're up to chapter 43 of sharing your life story. It's not about you. Being empathetic is about holding space for that person's experience. Now, I talked about asking open-ended questions to support someone, but not unending, right? If you keep battering them with question after question after question, they never have the opportunity to actually respond or kind of consider the first question that was asked. And then finally, listening with the intention to fix or solve the problem, right? That there's a problem here, that there's something wrong with what they are experiencing. But on the contrary, on the next slide, the ways that we might listen that will be more skillful is, rather than the intention to respond, with curiosity and the intention to understand. To bring compassionate presence to whatever is arising. That's the idea of attention, just giving someone your full attention, allowing silence and stillness. I call it sacred silence, because in the space, in silence, there's room for that person to reflect more deeply on their own experience and to find out what's arising, what meaning is coming for them from their experience. But if we keep battering them with questions and never have that space, that opportunity is taken away. As you heard with empathy, really seeing and hearing the depth of their experience. Oh, I've been here before. You're not alone. Being willing to enter into, their hell, their like darkness, being willing to be there in that darkness with them without trying to fix it, without saying that it's weird or it's wrong or they should do something different, but just being right in the thick of it with them. And you can see on the right-hand side, all these ways that we can bring ourselves to be present, right? To give them the gift of human attention, to be with them, not do for them. And as Brene Brown said towards the end, like, well, what happens if you still don't know what to say? You can just say that. I don't even know what to say right here. I don't have words for this. I am so glad that you feel comfortable and safe sharing this with me. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me with this. Thank you for sharing this with me. So different ways, right? It's not about fixing, it's about holding. I'm going to pass it back to Elizabeth.
There we go. Sorry, my mute button disappeared on my screen for some reason. After 3 years of Zoom, sometimes you still have the issues. So we want to now give you all a bit of practicing time with some of the things that we have talked about, and using a tool that we in our work find really helpful. I do want to say that our intention was to leave the last 15 minutes or so for questions, but if people have burning things that are coming up for you right now, feel free to put that stuff into the chat box, and we can, Erin and I can kind of do a dance, as we're kind of moving through some of this material. If there's anything that just feels like you want us to pause and address, and again, we're intending to leave some time at the end for that as well. So as I said, we're going to have you do some skills practicing in small breakouts. We're going to, I think we'll have 3 people to each group. Great. And Erin's working her magic behind the scenes to make that happen. I'm going to show you a short video here just to kind of, again, kind of mix things up, bring a little bit of lightness into the space, a little bit of different perspective. And then we'll go back to the next slide after that, and I'll talk more specifically about what we're going to have you do. And I'm sure, I'm assuming this video went viral for a while, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, but just kind of note what comes up for you as you're watching it.
It's just, there's all this pressure, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, I'm
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just
Don't.
try to say anything.
Okay, I always have issues getting out of here. Let me advance this and then okay, there we go. So again, contextually, right, a very different kind of exchange or relationship, right? That's an intimate couple. But noting those ways in which, right, we may be sitting with, accompanying someone, working with someone professionally, and we see the thing, right? We know the thing that needs to be done to make things better. That may not be our role in that scenario, right? That person does not need us to come in and fix, change, alter, bring in the magic solution, but rather just provide that presence and that way of being with, where they are able to essentially listen themselves into clarity, right? That we really are the conduit or the receiver, the witnesser of their experience. So we're going to have you again do these small breakouts, and we emailed, or I think Angela sent ahead of time, the handout that we had created. And one of the tools in there is something known as the reliever mnemonic. And typically this tool is something that people will use when working with clients that are navigating preparatory grief, right? Erin talked about that space where it's sort of that cognitive, emotional, spiritual reckoning with the thing that has shifted in your life, and the looking forward, the anticipatory piece of what this will mean for me. And so oftentimes using this reliever mnemonic is a really, kind of useful conceptual framework for us to hold and to say, what are the different things that I might be doing to signal that I am listening, that I care, and that, there are interventions available to support with this. So I'm not sure if we can get that to show up, the reliever mnemonic to show up, the handout in the chat box, but I'm going to also cut and paste it here into the chat box, and hopefully that will work as well, right? So the reliever, right, the mnemonic being a tool that we use where we use the first letter of each of these words, right? Reflect, empathize, lead, etc., to kind of guide us through these different considerations that we might be thinking through when we're sitting with someone. So again, the idea here is not that you're walking through, I'm reflecting, then I'm empathizing, then there may be an organic nature to this where, you start with the empathizing piece of, wow, I really can feel what's going on for you. And this is a really significant experience. This is a significant loss that I can tell is uprooting everything in your life. And then we may move to the reflecting state, right? I hear you saying that you do not know if you can continue with this disease much longer. I hear you saying that clearly, right? So as you can see in the chat box, the reliever is reflect, empathize. The L is to lead by exploring the concerns that someone might have. So tell me more about what are the concerns that you are feeling about your loved ones coping after you're gone, right? What does that mean to you? Tell me more about, so helping with that exploration piece. Improvise, meaning, right, keeping in mind that each person's experience will be potentially very different. So again, not every client's going to feel comfortable with you going through each of these steps. They may be less, reflective than more reflective. We can educate by really normalizing, right? Explaining the grief process and saying, yeah, everything that's going on right now is actually, very much a part of this. Validating the experience, reminding them again that this is normal. The education piece again might be kind of bringing in some of the elements that you've learned in this workshop or others. And then finally recalling by helping the person celebrate, right? Wow, you have had such a full life. Let's talk about some of the things that you're still really interested in doing with me. So we're going to have you in your breakout groups. One person is going to be an individual, and you're going to have to kind of make it up as you're going, right? You're the individual who is navigating this preparatory grief. I have a new diagnosis and I'm just really overwhelmed by it. ... And you're going to fill in the blanks around it. One person is going to be us as professional, right? However you're fulfilling that role in your life or your job. And then the third person will just be sort of the observer, noting what does this exchange look like, right? What are you seeing in terms of the application of this reliever mnemonic? So we will give you, we're going to give you about 8 minutes or so for this breakout. So you'll want to get in there, kind of get situated, identify who wants to take on what role, and then we'll send you a message about when you have about 2 minutes left, just so you can kind of anticipate the amount of time that you have together. Okay, so hopefully that's clear enough to everyone. I think when you're in your breakout rooms, we also have the ability to chat you this reliever mnemonic, so you can see it in those spaces as well. Erin, how are we doing with the breakouts?
Just give me one quick sec. A couple people dropped off, so I'm just going to, or actually maybe we'll just go with it. There's like 2 rooms that have 2 people, and so we'll just go with it. So some of you might not have an observer, but that's okay. And we are set for 8 minutes, so I'll open them now.
Enjoy your time. Welcome back, everyone. There's some people that seem like they're still in groups and most people are returning. And sorry if there was anything clunky about you getting into your room. Because sometimes with this many people, it's just a little bit of a trial and error to find you a virtual room to join. I can't see the breakout group thing, Erin. Are there still people?
It'll be about 25 seconds, Elizabeth, and then they'll all close and you'll start to see, and the participant numbers will go back up. Right now we have 31 in our main room.
Okay, so we'll just give that another.
So they're closing in 10 seconds and then everybody will start popping in.
So we're just waiting here a sec. Okay, there go the numbers. Welcome back, everyone. So we hope that that was just a helpful experience. I know it felt, sort of unreal in the sense that you're not actually working with a client, and you were sort of filling in some of the sort of role-playing holes. But okay, good. Sam, I see your comment that was helpful. Just curious, if anyone wants to put in the chat box, either as, the person who was responding and using the reliever mnemonic to kind of guide how you were with this person, any reflections on that, any ahas, anything that stood out to you, for the person who was receiving the support and being, kind of in the grief experience, anything that came up for you, or the observer just noting use of the reliever mnemonic. Just would love a couple of, chat box comments from people if anyone wants to reflect on what you noted. Good. Amy says being validated felt so good. I think that's something that even in role playing, right, where we oftentimes have the experience of, oh my gosh, how amazing was it just to be really listened to and validated in this way. It's something that I think so many of us are craving, and don't know that it's something that we feel like we oftentimes live without, right? Even in those states of wellness. We got to switch, and everyone said it was very helpful. Good. So I'm grateful. It sounds like this mnemonic in general is something that people are liking the application of. I was a person, but I have difficulty with listening and not interrupting any suggestions. That's, yeah, thank you for your honesty and your humility around that. I think the interrupting thing is something that, right, if we're so excited about a conversation or we've got ideas. One of the other mnemonics that we oftentimes use in our trainings is what? Or wait, why am I talking, right? And I oftentimes will have that just somewhere in like the front of my mind when I'm sitting with a client and I want to fill in those spaces or give an idea or something. Why am I talking? Why am I talking? Why am I talking? Right? And it's just a good reminder. And I think the more we practice with that, a lot of times what I find is we're filling in those spaces. And if I can let those more, kind of the lingering silences actually have a place in the room, right? Where the minute that person stops talking, I don't start going. More often than not, I find what happens is more of a revelatory sharing that will occur. We oftentimes are speaking, thinking I'm taking up too much space, or this person doesn't have enough time to be here with me. If we can really do that for one another and watch that interrupting, that why am I talking? It is, I think, one of the greatest gifts that we can give to one another as human to human. Need to keep practicing. Definitely one of those folks who wants to fix things, remove the nail. Yeah. And I think so many of us too, in the helping profession, right? We are here and doing this work because we have the desire to make things better for others. And I think that's why that, removing the nail video is so great. It's like, we can do it, but is that actually what's called for in the moment? Found the mnemonic very helpful to remind me not to fix, to listen and have options. Great. Being supportive and present, Meg, you're an awesome person. Being heard without imposing an opinion was comforting. Again, that, wow, how often do we have that experience where I can just share, and it really gets to be about me, right? That I'm not also having to navigate the opinion, or as Erin said, right, life story chapter 43 of this other person. I immediately felt my imposter syndrome sinking in. I wasn't able to offer this person relief, but as I moved through the mnemonic, I felt more secure in my ability to offer support. That's a beautiful reflection as well. So thank you for being willing just to, kind of experiment with that, to go off into to different groups with one another. I know that, it requires a different level of vulnerability sometimes. Right. Not sure if Amy, the dog, was an observer, but I use the time to know each other and bounce responses back and forth as a way to care without helping and fixing, but offering companionship. Beautiful. So again, it's the reliever mnemonic is not meant to be this prescriptive, I've got to do it this way, but I have found if I can have that around and with me, I've printed it out, I have it, kind of in my space. It just sometimes when you're sitting with someone, with their grief experience, and there's this question of, oh my gosh, where do I go from here? It's just it is a map in some ways, in this mapless state, to say, what else might I kind of offer in this space, from a place of compassion and competence. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, and I see some other questions coming in here. So let's move on, and then we can kind of go back and look at some of these other questions that are coming up for the Q&A section. So another tool that we wanted to highlight is something known as the grief map, or the grief positionality map. And this is a really, really powerful tool to use with people. I've had workshops where this was one thing of many I was talking about, and we ended up spending 45 minutes on it because people were so intrigued, and kind of as you follow the thread around this, you realize there is so much to do with this. So in a lot of ways, what this mapping does is it helps people sort of pause and say, okay, where am I as griever, right? As the aggrieved, where am I situated in the midst of my grief experience? And who are the individuals or the sources of support that surround me that I might, consciously pay attention to and or hold awareness around where these resources exist around me, right? So for example, if you are sitting with someone who just experienced a really significant grief experience, right? My husband died. The person would be the aggrieved, the center of this map. And then what we do is we start to, on these concentric circles, this person starts to say, okay, well, who is in the circle, right outside of you, right? And those are people who are more directly affected by the grief experience, but maybe not in the same way that you are. And then who are the people that might be outside of those individuals, right? So here in this example, the aggrieved, this person is at the center. Siblings, parents, kid, partner might be on that outer circle. On the circle out from that might be true friends or community, right? People who are really close to this individual who are also really affected. Outside of that might be colleagues or people that in the community that could be really supportive and might be able to come and bring food or, do something that feels like there's a way of stepping in, supporting. And then those are on the outside, right? People who we have looky-loos here, but people who may want to be involved, but actually don't really have a place there. And in some ways might be impacting in a negative way this person's grief experience, right? The other important thing to notice about this is the dump out and the comfort in, right? So saying to the person in the center, right, your role is to be in the center, right? Anyone who is on the concentric circles out from the center, their role is to comfort in, as in any energy that they extend towards this individual is all about comfort, about support, about being there for, about listening, etc. When you are in a concentric circle and you look outward, right, your job there is to sort of dump out, as in where are you going to the wider outer concentric circles for support, right? So I'm a sibling impacted by a grief experience, and I'm going to turn to my friends to say, I need support. Those friends are going to support, but then turn to other people in their life to get their grief support needs met. So it's just a really helpful visual for people to understand the ways in which, wait, what is the role we're playing in all of this? Where am I getting my needs met, right? And am I so for example, am I a true friend who is so impacted by this grief experience that I keep going to the aggrieved and saying, I can't believe this happened. This is happening. I'm totally flailing. I don't know what to do here, right? That directional sort of grieving is actually going to be less helpful to the person at the center of this grief map. So I've done this with a lot of clients where I sit down and just say, okay, either you're supporting somebody in a grief experience. Where do you show up in this grief map? And where can you identify sources of support for yourself, right? Where are you consciously extending your own grief, your own emotional experience away from the griever? If I am the griever, who are the people that I am drawing in around me? So we'll share, as we said, we'll share the slides, and we're hoping that this will be a helpful a visual. There's a lot more online that you can find about this tool, but in the time that we have, we're only able to touch upon it in a pretty peripheral way, or concise way, I guess I should say. And then wanting just to revisit this idea of emotional intelligence, the way that we are aware of both our three centers, right? Our mind, our heart, and sort of that body or gut-based sort of response or experience that we're having ourselves. And then also being able to track what might be going on for the person that I am with. And are they relying upon these different centers in a more trend-like basis, right? So for some people, we may go to the mind more and say, okay, well, what happened here? What are the details I should be paying attention to? What happened? When did it happen? Why did it happen? It can get pretty like mind focused, right? And oftentimes for people, especially in the grief experience, that kind of cerebral spin can be something that really is unbalancing for people. Other people can spend a lot more time in the heart, right? That sense of the emotions and the deep feelings around something. And the way that they'll talk about it is, I feel so sad. I feel so heavy. I feel so dark. This is a really, intense emotional experience for me. Also, very normal and a part of the grief experience. And then the third, you can hear people oftentimes, those that are a little bit more gut or body based will describe their experience in sensations, right? Like I find myself shaking all the time. My temperature fluctuation is really great. I'm having this all over body kind of goosebump thing happening. So one, highlighting this to normalize, right? The way that the grief experience moves through us can happen. It can happen in a variety of different ways. And we oftentimes as humans have those centers that we just kind of naturally orient towards. So one, just to watch this, and two, to offer up to people, if you see somebody who is very, very kind of cerebral in their grief experience, what are we things that we can do to kind of bring them a little bit back into the body, right? Into the heart space. Because oftentimes what will happen, if you can find a little bit more equilibrium between these three states, we are able to perceive and be with experiences in a different and in a more holistic manner. And then to highlight this, to say, for ourselves, right, when we are with others, is there a way to attune to ourselves so that we equally are able to place attention on the mind, the heart, and the body for ourselves, right, as a source of grounding and presence? If we get overly cerebral or mental around things, that's oftentimes where we can do the interrupting, where we can do the over talking, where we can do there's got to be a solution here. What do we do? If we're over kind of emotion or heart based, we can sometimes bleed into or over into the experience of the person that we're with. And if we're body-based, it oftentimes people have said, I kind of become so much more aware of kind of where I am in this experience that it kind of creates sometimes a disconnect between me and the other. So just highlighting this as a way or a reminder to say, what does it look like to hold an awareness of these three centers as both supporter and calling awareness for those that we are supporting in terms of their centers and finding more balance here. So Erin, I'm going to hand it over to you to close out this last section, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you. So we kind of wanted to finish up and touch on that third objective of what can we do to maintain a grounded sense of our own self as we companion others. And the picture I have is of a cup of water, because the old cliche of filling your own cup and keeping your cup full is really important, as I mentioned, in companioning folks through grief and loss. We can run into what's called empathic distress, commonly referred to as compassion fatigue, but now in more recent research is called empathic distress. The idea that you aren't able to continue to do the work because you aren't able, and really it comes from the inability to process your own grief and to take care of yourself. And so I like to call it self-stewardship rather than self-care, because self-care has so many kind of superficial connotations these days. And so the ways that we go through self-stewardship and taking care of ourselves so that we can continue to companion and hold space for others is to really recognize first your own response to the work. As Elizabeth said, that really you could go back to that mind, heart, and body feeling for your own response in hearing another's story. The second point is to acknowledge that you too will grieve your own personal losses, as well as sometimes the losses of your clients. And that this kind of touches back to earlier slides where I talked about disenfranchised grief, giving ourselves the ability to acknowledge that, wow, I knew that person too. And I'm really feeling this, or I'm really feeling, because I'm so, have a really good relationship with this particular client who is grieving this loss. I'm feeling really a sense of grief for them and for what they've lost, and normalizing that as well, not pushing that away and not saying, well, I shouldn't feel this way because this is my professional role and I need to have this boundary. Yes, absolutely. Personal and professional boundaries are important. And also to recognize where there's softness or fluidity in those boundaries, and how can you take care of yourself and acknowledge what you're feeling about this. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some essential building blocks for resilience and sustainability. If you'll go back just one, Elizabeth. And I want to start with the idea of your own foundation. What is your foundation for taking care of yourself? This could be your own spiritual practice or religious practice and religious community. This could be the things you do on a weekly or daily basis to care for yourself. So that might be exercise, walking in nature, writing. Maintaining those practices and that community really does help to build a foundation for resilience. It's when we let go of those things because we're too busy, or we don't want to acknowledge our grief. When those building blocks, those foundational pieces go away, that's where we can get into trouble and run into our own inability to stay present and stay with the work. So on the next slide now, I want to talk about something called the pause. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. You can find a video about the pause on YouTube, but there's a nurse from the University of Virginia who was an emergency room nurse. And just saw the distress that was coming up for his coworkers when someone died under their care. And then they were expected to just move on, to just take off their gloves and walk away and go to the next room. And so he developed this practice called the pause. And I really advocate for incorporating this into your own kind of practice, or that of if you're working with a group of coworkers, to acknowledge, especially when you lose someone, when someone dies who you've been working with. And the way that they phrase it in the pause is to take a moment. Can we take a moment to pause and honor this person? This was someone who was alive. Now they've passed away. It was a person. They were someone who was loved and who loved. They were a friend and a family member. And so let's take a moment. Let's take this silent moment and honor that person, as well as all the valiant efforts that were made on their behalf. Right? So however you might be working with someone, taking a moment to acknowledge all that you did in relationship with that person, all the efforts that you made on their behalf. On the next slide, the touchstone is another practice that I really appreciate. And it's another practice that came from a more institutional setting, from a hospital setting, where there was a chaplain and there was this beautiful big kind of marble touchstone at the entryway to the hospital. And this chaplain developed the practice of every day at the end of their shift, they would go through the main entrance of the hospital, put their hand on the touchstone, and acknowledge each of the people they had been with that day, all the efforts that they had made during that day for all of those people, and take a breath to acknowledge what had been done and what had been accomplished. And then as they moved their hand away from that touchstone and turned and left the building, they left it all there at the hospital. And so this is a way to cultivate a little softness around your boundaries and be able to find a balance between work and life, to have resilience in that you're not compartmentalizing necessarily, but you're giving your grief, you're giving your emotional experience a place. And you're acknowledging it physically, emotionally, and letting it be what it is, where it is, and then turning and moving to the rest of life, because we have to be able to have a balance to do the work that we all do. We're all here in very different roles, some in very similar roles, but in order to be able to continue in this work for the long run and to be really helpful and supportive companions to others who are experiencing grief and loss, we have to be able to take care of our own grief, our own loss. We have to celebrate our efforts and to recognize the work that we do matters. And to also have our lives away from and separate from our work, to find that balance for ourselves. Because if we can find that balance, it brings a mind, a heart, and a body balance and allows us to live in alignment with our purpose, as well as with the separation of work and life. So again, just to acknowledge, or just to remind you, one, what is in your foundation? What are the practices that you already have that you can continue so that you maintain, you keep filling your cup and you're serving from a full cup? Can you take a pause and acknowledge when there's been a loss of your own? And can you find a way to have a touchstone or a separation or a place to allow your grief, your loss, your work to rest when you return back to the rest of your life? The next slide. So to finish, Douglas Steere was a Quaker, and this, just to kind of encapsulate what we've talked about today, that to listen another's soul into a condition of disclosure and discovery may be the greatest service that any human being ever performs for another. Again, our listening is to allow space for that other person to discover on their own. And that is the greatest service that we can provide for another. Next slide. This is our contact information. You can email us, info@thepeacefulpresenceproject. Our website is thepeacefulpresenceproject.org. And you'll have this in the slides. But now we'd like to spend these last 15 minutes hearing from you and answering any questions or hearing comments and feedback. And so Elizabeth can stop the share and we'll open it up.
And before I do that, I'm actually going to, there's a great question in the chat box about in grief positionality, where are caregivers to aggrieved to family? So I just wanted to go back to that image really quickly here. And Melissa commented and said, I labeled the line between looky-loos and colleagues as professionals, and I included caregivers in this group. And I think that's great. What I also want to say is there is nothing about this where there's a rule or that it's prescriptive, right? You might have an individual that you're caregiving for, and they, they're the person at the center of this experience going through a massive grief experience, right? And you as caregiver could very well be the closest thing to them, right? You might be with them daily. They may not have children. You might build up a really close ongoing relationship with this person. And so being impacted by their grief experience, you could very well be in, that concentric circle right out from them or one out from there. So I think it just depends upon the nature of the relationship, and that really impacts where people kind of show up on this map. In that caregiver role, the important thing to pay attention to is wherever we as caregivers show up in this map, that we're doing the, comforting into that person, especially because that's part of the role that we're fulfilling, and that we're learning how to get our grief needs met by dumping out and moving to people and farther in our concentric circles. So just wanted to touch on that before doing this stopping the screen share. So there we go. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. And then there was another question in here. Robert had asked, one question I would have would be about the language you use specifically around comments like I know or I understand. I've been taught that we should steer away from these types of comments for the reflective listening. Is this language you would recommend we use? I think that's a great question. And I would love to hear if anyone else on, this call has reflections related to that. I think it's a lot about knowing our audience and knowing the person that we are with. For some, right, reflective listening to say, I understand or I know this is in a way making it more about us and what we understand or what we perceive around the situation. I will say, though, I've worked with people who felt really painfully misunderstood in their grief experience, in their navigation of a disease trajectory, etc. And that comment, I understand, was actually one of the most meaningful things to be able to say, because it created a sense of trust and confidence in that relationship to say, oh, somebody else in my world understands or desires to understand what this looks like for me. So Erin, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that question, or if anyone else wants to.
Yeah, I think what you said was spot on. It's not, I think if you're using I understand as, well, I understand because I did, and you go into your own story, it's different than, thank you for sharing that with me. That really helps me understand what you're going through. It's a different way of using I understand. I think I know does feel like a little bit of a danger zone, right? I know what you're going through, because you don't. But I think if you frame it as a gratitude for their sharing that helps you to understand, I think it's a very different framing and use of that term.
And recenters their experience. Absolutely. So we have about, I don't know, Angela, if you need more time here at the end, I think we probably have another 5 minutes or so. If anyone wants to, if there are no questions or even comments, reflections about, wow, I see some great comments here about this being helpful and helpful. Glad it was recorded. I know we went through in 2 hours a lot of material. Like I said, we actually had to thin down a fair amount. So I'm grateful it's recorded as well. Kara, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts. Something that comes up a lot in my area is that even if folks feel like they're doing everything right to be present, they're getting the same calls every day from the same people, and either because of mental health issues or cognitive issues, that person's kind of stuck in that grief experience or their story, and you can just see how draining it is for our case managers who are kind of doing it every day. So I don't know, and I know we talked a little bit about boundaries. Would just love to hear your thoughts on how to protect ourselves in that situation while still wanting to give and be present for people that maybe need a lot.
Erin, I can tag team off of you if you want some reflections.
Sure. I think what comes up for me in that question is that sometimes I think the exhaustion comes from feeling like, yes, that you're not doing, like you said, you're not doing enough. You're not fixing anything because they keep calling back. And that the idea is not to have to fix it, but just to be able to hold it. And sometimes, like you said, it could be a mental health or a cognitive issue that brings them back. And also being that safe person can bring them back. And I've had a lot of clients who it's the same, it's been the same story over weeks and weeks and weeks, and you hear the same thing, and it's just like this constant cycle. And just being able to say, I don't have to fix this. I don't have to make it different. I don't have to make them shift away from saying the same thing over and over again. And so I think just being able to say, and I get the exhaustion and that kind of repetitive nature. And I just wonder about around the boundaries and how much there's an opportunity to work as a team sometimes and be able to say, we do this sometimes with people, like, can you field this call today? Or can you see this person today? I just can't do it today. Those are kind of my thoughts. Elizabeth, what would you add?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the quote by Richard Rohr where he says, pain that's not is transformed is transmitted, right? That it's passed along. And I think that there is a true reality when we accompany people in their grief experience, or we show up in that supporter or helper role, where we can take it on a lot, right? Where it sort of gets woven into our kind of our physiology and our psyche in certain ways. And so I think that there is, especially in cases where it's ongoing, where it feels like there's a sensation of there's not a lot of movement here. I'm being impacted in a way, right? We have to keep our eyes on the reality of if I'm really being impacted by somebody's experience, as in it's not transforming in any way. We're not going to be able to show up and support in those scenarios to our greatest capacity. And so, as Erin said, I think it's really bringing it back to whatever that team is that you have available and saying, what else can be done here? I'm exhausted. I am not the person that's actually able to continue to do this with this person in this way. And then, I've done that with people too, where I pull out the grief positionality map and say, okay, where do you consider me in this map? What other resources are here that we might also kind of tag team or pull in? And sometimes it's helpful to give people the responsibility of, I'm not the only sort of taproot or source of support for you in the world. Like who else can we engage? And I know for a lot of isolated older adults that may not be, there may not be a lot of people on that positionality map. But to get them to think creatively a little bit more beyond just you as supporter can be sometimes helpful.
One other thing that just came up was just thinking about for our own protecting our own selves is the concept of beginner's mind. And in those repetitive, continual, just to open up to this being a new experience for you as well each day, right? Especially for someone with cognitive issues, and that this is something totally new for them. And how can you take that perspective of the beginner's mind and like, okay, it's a whole new day. This is a whole new thing. I know, and just kind of letting go of the fact that you've heard it a dozen or 24 or 14,000 times. And just what perspective could I take differently? How could I listen differently today? How could I hold this differently today as if I've never heard it before?
And I see Sharon's comment in the chat box about wishing this was taught in schools. I think it'd create a more compassionate and kind society. I agree. If we were to prioritize, what we refer to as grief and death literacy in so many different contexts, we would be, practiced, and kind of that second natured way of showing up for one another would be really different. And then Thomas saying, not fixing, but holding will be a good mantra for me working with some individuals. Great. Happy that's a helpful mantra for you. So we're probably almost there at time. Angela, we'll hand it back to you. As we said, we'll share out the slide deck with people, our contact information, all this content is there. And we're just really grateful for all of you showing up today, being, dedicated to this level of learning, and happy to be in community with each of you.
Thank you both. And I'm going to pass it to Luhati.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Erin and Elizabeth, for this great presentation, and also for sharing the PowerPoint for us to send it out to our participants today. So just a reminder, you will receive an email from us regarding this presentation with a PowerPoint along with the NASW survey. Please note the deadline to submit that, and then be on the lookout for a PSU survey as well. We hope that you can join us on our next month's presentation, September 7th, and it will be presented by our one and only Angela Franklin. And if you attend that, you will also receive a QPR certificate of attendance, meaning you'll be certified for 3 years. Anyway, thank you so much, and we hope to see you next month. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.